are you like now like kind of like are you designated note taker now?
Well, you know, Ben was gonna do it tonight,
Okay.
so we almost messed that up. So yeah, I'll try to do it within 5 days, which I read was the thing.
I hear it. I'm just like, you know.
Yeah. I just read that. Mike, the school board guy, Mike mentioned.
Did you mention it?
He said, yeah, we're gonna close up 5 days according to the law.
I know it is, but yeah.
Yeah.
I'll see you.
Okay.
Take care. Bye. Bye, Lauren.
Good luck with the fundraising.
Yeah, thank you.
There's no scissors. It's gonna hurt. I should not have given Andy the tape. I'll be back. We'll ask more tables this way.
Yeah, they did not give me shit. But at least they gave me everything else.
They didn't give you tape?
Yeah.
That's it? No. Your cost gappers. $20 a roll.
Is it?
Doesn't leave as much, but got enough wires. That's usually like, that doesn't really happen for a couple of days or if it gets hot. That's when that becomes a big issue. Or it gets that sticky stuff on it. It's not perfect.
Pretty good.
Boy, we better figure this out soon. You think that's okay?
Yeah.
You're gonna be staying with me. So I'm gonna big surprise. Complex.
Yes.
Well,
Oh, hey.
Hey.
Hi, Lee.
Hey.
Hello.
can I help
Thanks
you?
for coming. Sure, I'm just setting up a snack. I got kind of derailed. I had a bunch of stuff in my tote bag. I was gonna do bagels and cream cheese, and I turned out to talk about bagels.
Oh, that's my fault for making bagels.
You cleared out the bagels. I believe it.
No, it's my fault that I suggested them and then it messed you up.
No, it was such a good idea too. Like if I do it again, I feel like I'll just like go in the morning. I think that would have been so fun.
That's probably all right.
Well, I really love that you came out and that you're interested. Yeah, that's the best. I feel guilty that I'm doing that. I'm not good at it.
We know each other just through my husband who's on the board here too.
You got me turning late on
I was
this.
just saying,
So
my.
you're,
Downstairs, so I just.
Thanks for coming. Yeah, with Megan. Yeah.
I have a bunch of stuff to do.
Here, what can I?
She's really good, you know, but she tends to.
Oh, I don't want to. Yeah. That's great.
Yeah.
Talking birds.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
work for the city.
Oh, Ben.
Oh,
Yes, yes, yes. Facebook face.
Well,
It was. Your face is familiar, but I didn't figure.
I remember, I've seen you at a couple.
Yeah, not
oh, yeah. Oh, you had it. One of those today.
Right across there.
Figure out where to premiere. And I was listening on it, and it was so. You had it one of those, yeah.
Cool, that's nice to hear. I love it. I used to teach at Briggs, and I love it. Oh,
Left one in.
cool.
Another.
What do you want? Yeah, we have.
Right, yeah, they're so really good.
He was very. I can't find that button for more than a moment.
So nice.
We have a pretty good flavor.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Like, I told you, like, it was just really good. I can do all this. So, I the jazz recipes, so I managed
It's the next one over.
very, there's other stuff that's not like showcase with burgers. So, no, it's good. I don't visit her house. Everyone have some snacks. We work very hard for some.
Another member.
Yeah.
Yeah, you eat that, but just stay, we got to figure it out.
In my head, there was this hockey player, Pavel and so I'm like, okay, who's gonna remember Pavel? I'll always remember Scott.
I was saying that my plan things really goes.
Oh, well, I guess I'll have to see.
Those are the best.
Yeah, grandmother, they were there, they left.
Tracy's right there.
On South,
And you know what, Jeff and Mike aren't gonna be here, so you're the whole BSDs.
I'm not sure it'll be that long.
That's okay, no, we'll just.
Yeah.
And I'm here.
Are they staying for you?
Yeah, oh, I think they're gonna try it, but they can't.
Yeah.
I guess they just. Mike said all this.
Signing on.
She helps all her other cars. She was recently. She got paid. Or it's a stress. Oh. Our sister station. Yes. Very wrong.
Right. That was one of the things that was out there, right? Yes.
It was a long time ago.
Record saying that. I don't know, I mean, I like things that VHS, so I feel like it's something to me, but. Yeah, but you're really handle VHS, that's right, so hopefully we don't. Yeah, I'm not saying could he say, that would be, probably a best. Yeah, otherwise I.
You can try it too. It's all out there. What did you guys do?
I think we're gonna end up with 6 computers. That's my plan. Yes, I did. My face after.
That's one of the worst case.
Oh my God.
Bobby was in the Oh, yeah.
That's the opposite side. Big, big.
I heard that one was coming on a USB.
Let's do it. It's a little too soon.
I didn't get that right there. You want to have me?
Where did we from there? Oh, no,
This is that page. There's two L's.
Well, we did 15 minutes.
There is? I can't see it.
Oh, yeah. There you go.
Better? Sure. Put it on my. Like sharing takes too long to type. Of course, I took a whole minute to do that. See, the left. All right, we'll go to quiet mode.
What's your name? You're not at this point, Chip Mason wrote that he was work travel. Did you work for Joe?
What?
Chip wrote that he was. Oh, who you were talking?
Yeah, it was.
She came up at the candidate forum, she came up, so at the end of it.
Yeah.
How you doing?
Anyway, she said they're.
I just have notes. Nothing to table to display.
Oh,
Okay,
yeah.
make sure I put all the pages up there. Everything everywhere. Thanks.
All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for being here. Ward 5 Neighborhood Planning Assembly meeting, March 21st, our March meeting. By means of introduction, my name is Ben Travers. I'm on the Ward 5 NPA Steering Committee. I live here on Home Avenue. And we're trying to make more of an effort here to get back to a practice that we had in meetings past to sort of, we have a small enough crowd that it works for us to sort of go around the room and give everyone here an opportunity to introduce themselves as well. That's sort of the benefit of having these types of meetings, is it's a little more free-flowing and open to that type of dialogue. And so, Scott, can we start with you?
Sure. I'm Scott. Give it away. I live over on St. Paul Street.
Okay, I'm Spencer, I live across the street of the Flint Avenue Co-ops.
I'm Shearston Bohm, I live on Dunder Road.
John Shenton on Bear Street.
I'm Marcia Gusterson, I live on Austin Drive.
Lauren, you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Lauren, I live in South Burlington.
Hi, Lauren. Lauren's here. It's right to say you're from CEDO, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
And we're, Lauren's helping out because for the last, I would say, almost a year or so, we've been live streaming our meetings with the help of Channel 17. So that's what's going on there. Andy?
Andy Simon, I live on Logan Street, and I'm on the steering committee. I'm Samuel Leary, I live on Austin Drive.
I'm Joanna Gustman, I live right down the street on Flint, and I'm on the street.
Harris Rowan, I live on Scarborough.
Paul Smith, Austin Drive.
Elisa Nelson, Austin Drive.
Dar Harbor, and I also live on Scarpath. Tracy Gabler, I live on Shelburne.
Joe Derry, I'm on the steering committee, I'm on Ferguson.
All right, great. So we have a couple other members of the steering committee who couldn't be here tonight, Bill Keogh, Alec Bauer, and Mohammed Jafar. I suppose now might be a good opportunity to mention to you all that our April meeting is when we'll be having our steering committee elections. We have 7 seats currently on the steering committee. The terms are for 1 year, so everyone who's on the steering committee currently will be up for re-election, and anyone who's interested in going out for it should come to the meeting this coming month in April. Our meetings are always the 3rd Thursday of the month, so our April meeting will be on April 18th. And the way it goes is if we have more than 7 people interested in it, then we'll in effect have a vote of sorts of all the Ward 5 residents who are here in attendance. So if you're interested, please put it on your calendars, come on April 18th. If you have any questions about being on the steering committee, feel free to ask me, Andy, Joanna, or Joe, or anyone else who's on there. Our email addresses are online. They're also on the agenda here. Yeah.
Anybody need an agenda?
Yeah. And what I'll tell you is that I think we have at least 3 steering committee members now who will not be running for re-election. So, so there will be quite a bit of turnover. So if you are interested in coming out, please do come. All right. So before we turn to our main agenda, now that we've done the introductions, we'd also sort of like to open it up for open forum if anyone has any comments. If you could come forward just so we have the microphone and so on. Anyone for open forum? Yeah, you want to come on up?
Is there anyone else? Am I the only one? Okay.
All right, is this just for you or is this for amplification? Is it? Oh, okay. I didn't sound much louder. Hi, neighbors. This is my first time here at this NPA. I've just moved to Austin Drive last summer. I'm here, I've been presenting, going to a number of city council meetings and city council commission meetings regarding the bike share and scooter share program. Does anyone here know what that is? So there's a proposal to have an electric bike, electric assist bikes and electric assist scooters. There'll be the proposal is that there would be 200 of each of those vehicles in the Burlington area. My concern has been about e-scooters. E-scooters to me pose a serious danger because these scooters, if you don't know what they are, they're like a skateboard with handlebars. They push a button and they go up to 15 miles an hour. So you're on a skateboard with handlebars. and you're going 15 miles an hour, and they're really zippy and they're really fun if you're riding them, if you're walking a dog, or if you're walking on the sidewalk, or if you are driving a vehicle, or many other things that people are doing. They are not as much fun, and they're actually dangerous. They're dangerous for the people who ride them as well, because they go 15 miles an hour, there's no helmet required, and they're really zippy and really fun. They've actually been declared a public health emergency by the American Society of Trauma Surgeons. So they're really a problem. I've been speaking about them because I think they would be a problem in Burlington and really have an impact in our communities that we don't know about. So I've been going to some city council meetings. There's a small group of people who have been attending different NPAs. And I also was just at the Department of Public Works, which is involved in this launch. Around this, and what would happen is the plan is it's a collaboration between the city of Burlington and this company called Gotcha Bikes. The bikes that currently we have in the bike share program have sort of been a failure because people don't ride. They're 7 gears and they're hard to get up Burlington hills. So they haven't really been very successful. So the proposal is to replace them. The idea is that these are commuter vehicles. But I just wanted to alert people to it, let your city council member know about it. I've been to a couple of these meetings with the Department of Public Works, as I said, and that's been Sharon Bouchard and Max Tracy and Dave Hartnett. Those are the 3 city council members who are involved in that committee. Dave Hartnett is rolling off, but Sharon Bouchard and Max Tracy are really open to listening to concerns about this. My voice is saying that until people see them and are exposed to them and actually witness how intrusive they can be, because what happens with these scooters is they just park on the sidewalk, they live on the sidewalk. This company proposes to address that problem through having what they're calling geofencing. So rather than just be dropped anywhere and picked up anywhere, there is going to be sort of like corrals that they're supposed to go to, but there's not really a requirement that they go to those corrals. Those corrals are still going to be on the sidewalks, and they still feel like litter on the sidewalks. So when the battery runs out, people just drop them in a pile, and you've got a big pile of these metal things with blinking lights that basically look, feel, and are litter. Some people are really excited about them because they're a fun way to get around, but without having a sense of our community understanding them, introducing them more slowly and introducing them more safely, I'm really concerned about it. The other thing is that there's no liability laws right now, so if you got hit by someone on one of those scooters, tough luck. Who knows who hit you? They drive off. That's that. In Santa Monica, there was a 7-hour-long city council meeting of person after person coming up and talking about getting hit by someone on those scooters and harmed by someone on those scooters, and that there was no response from the scooter company, who could actually probably identify, because this is all electronic now, and who's on it at what time. So anyway, I want you to pay attention to it. It's something that when it was first proposed by the city just a few weeks ago, they wanted to have these on the streets by Memorial Day of this year. Even though there is no laws, regulations, ordinances that kind of define what these vehicles are, where they need to be, where they need to go, where they're not allowed to be. If there is going to be laws about that, who's going to enforce them? Police are going to run around on the sidewalks giving people tickets. They kind of have a lot of other things to do. We're going to hear about some other things that they have to do tonight. So pay attention to it. I'm sorry that our city council member from our ward's not able to make it tonight, but let people think about it, talk about it. There was an article in 7 Days, I was quoted in it, that was about the e-scooters, and that's how you can find a little more local information about it. So that's.
What do you think about the bikes?
I'm personally not as opposed to the bikes, because e-assist bikes do allow people who don't have the physical fitness or capacity to get places, and I just rode one. People know what a bike is.
Right, and there are rules for bikes.
And there are rules for bikes. So it's still an issue in terms of having helmets and things, and they do go fast. I just rode one. There were just these demos, and it was like, wow, this really is great. And I went down a hill to see what it was like to come back up the hill, and it was really great to have that e-assist coming up a hill. So I personally don't have the same issue, although some of the people who have been speaking about it are concerned about them being on the bike path, because they do go faster. They go up 20 miles an hour. I think maybe even a little faster than that. That's really fast. If you're a cyclist and you're going 15, 20 miles an hour, that's really fast. So part of the issue is our multi-use on the paths. The bike path isn't that wide, that there's so many different lanes for different vehicles going different rates of speed. And those are some of the things that need to be considered as people who are doing transportation planning. They think about the different lanes for different speeds. And right now we don't have any of that. So I think that the scooters are coming too fast. So that I'm saying, let's slow it down. If it's inevitable, let's at least slow it down and do it right. The mayor was like, we're going to be different than all of these other cities, but we're doing it the exact same way as all of these other cities. So we need to, it's not like Burlington is magically going to be different if we're going to do it the same way that other places have done it. Thank you.
Oh, nice.
Any questions or, all right, yeah, you take that, thanks. I do have a couple of handouts if anybody want ones, that kind of, these statements that I sent to the city council if you want one. Okay, thank you.
We also have some representatives from DPW coming later on the agenda tonight. They're here specifically to talk about their plan for bike infrastructure along Flint Avenue, but I know they're also always open to other questions, so I suspect that they'd be more than open to talking about the issue that you just discussed as well. Anyone else for open forum? Harris?
Make this really quick.
Yeah, no problem.
I just wanted to say that we're having a fundraiser dinner gathering at our house on Monday, April 1st at 6:30. And what this is for is there's this fantastic project going on of sending hospital supplies that are going to be discarded, basically. And there's a woman in Maine, I can't remember her name, but she organizes containers, puts them on ships and sends them to places that need them. So there is one now, as I speak, going to Sudan to a hospital there that my wife has been working with someone on, and that's great. So they really need an X-ray machine, so they're trying to raise money for that. It's a 400-bed hospital, and they have nothing. You said there's beds, but there's not even bedding. You know, it's that kind of situation. So it's a really great project. So you're all invited. April 1st, 6:30 at 46 Scarf Ave, corner of Scarf and Wells.
People have questions, is there a way they can get in touch with you? Sort of best email or
Yes.
along those lines?
Yes,
I
email
don't want
me.
to put you on the spot. But
Yeah, good idea. Harris@rowan.net. HARRIS@ROEN.net.
I saw something about it on Front Porch.
It was in Front Porch Forum today. Yep.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks, Harris. And you'll see Harris again, because Harris is one of our planning commissioners, and they're also on the agenda tonight, so we'll see Harris back up here. Okay, anyone else for open forum? Joe?
I was wondering if you wanted to bring up the budget resolution.
Yeah, I was gonna bring that up, unless, does anyone else have anything for open forum?
I just want to mention that next month in April, we're hoping to organize in honor of Earth Day, organize a panel on climate change. And we are trying to get Mary Sullivan, our state, one of our state reps, who's very active in climate issues, somebody from the city, and I'm hoping somebody from 350 Vermont, to talk about how urgent this is and what we can and are not doing about it.
Yeah.
Where's it gonna be?
It's gonna be the NPA meeting in April here.
And we'll update everyone once we put the agenda together on Front Porch Forum, Facebook, other avenues as well. Okay, anything else? All right, so what Joe was mentioning is, whereas we try to operate things relatively informally here, there is some formal structure around the NPAs, and we have some bylaws and such, and that's one of the other things, by the way, which we want to try to address in April, is to dust off the bylaws and to make a couple changes in ways that make more sense now in 2019 than they made sense when last time Elisa worked on them, which was a little while ago now. But the bylaws allow for us to, even if something's not on the agenda, there's various mechanisms by which we can add something to the agenda, and it requires a majority vote of the Ward 5 residents who are here. And the reason why I sort of give you that context is, for all the NPAs, there's this organization which is known as the All Wards Organization, and it's basically an entity that all the steering committee members from all the wards are invited to get together from time to time to talk about citywide issues. And at the last meeting we went to that Joanna and I were at, we continued a discussion which started to come up last fall and has continued through now about Npa funding. I won't go into a big, long sort of history course about it, but the NPAs used to have a lot more vibrant funding. A lot of it was tied to the Community Development Block Grant Program, which which allowed for more micro grants than it currently allows for, and the NPA had a bit more control over where that money went to. But as time has gone on, that money has been less available for micro grants, and the city has otherwise rolled back the budget for the NPA such that each ward at the moment has a budget of only $400 a year. It doesn't, from the perspective of the steering committee members now, and there's sort of a general consensus among all the NPAs, it doesn't allow us an opportunity to be all that creative. Yes, we can bring in some snacks from time to time, but if we ever really wanted to talk about something more ambitious, like having a block party, or Lisa mentioned they did a pancake breakfast back in the day, or if we wanted to try to make these meetings more accessible by being able to bring in, say, paid sitters to offer childcare services to individuals, or these are the old sort of NPA signs that we would put around the neighborhood to advertise the meetings, but a lot of them advertise the meetings as taking place over at DPW, and obviously we're no longer there. It'd be nice to have, from our perspective, a little additional funding for us to be able to afford those things. And so at the all wards meeting that we were at, each of the NPAs agreed to go back to their respective assemblies and to ask the assembly to vote in favor of a resolution which would be forwarded to the city council asking that each ward's budget be increased to $2,500 every year. Perhaps it's a sort of ask for more than thou shalt receive type analysis, but that was the resolution that each group agreed to bring back to their respective assemblies. Some of the other wards have already, some of the other NPAs have already endorsed it, but the reason why I'm hoping to get it on the agenda tonight, and we've already chipped into it a little bit, but we had about 15 minutes baked into the end of our agenda, and I was hoping to come back to this resolution. It's a pretty cut and dry type thing, and I'd be willing to circulate it all to you when we get to that point. But effectively, it simply asks for an increase in the FY20 budget to $2,500. So I suppose the question that I would present right now, and I'll present it sort of in a more formal way than we normally do, but it's just to ask you all whether or not you'd be okay with our spending a few minutes at the very end of our agenda to come back to this item. And the way that we have to get that on the agenda is I think the right way to do this is to ask you all for a motion of sorts, for someone to move to add that to the end of the agenda. If there's a second, then we can have a vote, and if we have a majority of hands in the room, then we can move it to the end of the agenda. So at this point in time, I'd entertain if anyone has a motion to add that item to the end of the agenda.
I'd like to add it to the end of the agenda.
Okay, motion by Joe. Anyone second? Thanks, Paul. All right, so I'll take a vote now, and again, this is just on the question of whether or not we can come back to this for a few minutes at the end of the meeting, and I have some papers here to circulate when we get there, but if you're in favor of discussing this at the end of the agenda, all in favor, if you could raise your hand. Okay, so I think we have a majority, so I won't ask for those against. So we'll double back to that at the end of the agenda, so thank you all. All right, so now to the main agenda. As Andy mentioned, one of the things that the steering committee discussed doing is trying to, oftentimes our meetings are sort of a hodgepodge, like tonight, but we've also talked about having more theme type meetings. Like in April, we've been talking about having a climate change meeting, and last fall we had a meeting that was dedicated to opioids and the overdose crisis, and we had a really great conversation, discussion with Jackie Corbally, the citywide opiate manager, with folks from the Howard Center, and other individuals who are involved with this issue of vital importance to our community. We also had one of our neighbors, Scott Pavek, here, but unfortunately he was at the end of our agenda, and the discussion went on so long that Scott got bounced, and he was kind enough to allow for us to continue the discussion with some of the other folks who were there, while also agreeing to come back in, and to make sure it didn't happen again tonight, we've put Scott right in the front of the agenda this time around. But we thought it was timely to bring him back in now, because I don't know if folks went to it the other night, but the city hosted its opioid town hall. Scott has a very personal story that I'll let him tell with respect to his experience with the issue, and he's been able to leverage that issue into being a real community leader on this issue, and it's how I've gotten to know him, and really glad and proud to have him here in Ward 5, and wanted to give him an opportunity to come in and talk to you all. So thanks, Scott.
having me back, everybody. I appreciate it. Never complain that a discussion about that topic ever goes over, and the fact that it spilled over into a second session I really appreciate. So thanks for having me here. I have a crazy amount of notes despite talking about this. It feels like every day and most hours of my life, so bear with me as I look right here. But Ben wanted to have me back to share a little bit about my story and as well as about my role as a representative on CompStat. I represent our community in the monthly opioid policy meetings held by the city, and for that reason it made sense to me to start a dialogue to figure out how I can really represent, well, you all. It's not just my own priorities. But to that end, I certainly have priorities of my own, and I think it would be helpful when thinking about my work or in that role, just an understanding of where I'm coming from and where I've been. So to that end, I'm a person in recovery. That's not exactly a surprise based on the context of the meeting, but I began using opioids when I was 16. I found recovery at the age of 22, and my journey to recovery was a hard one. I did the stereotypical things, or the things that you would expect when you hear about a story of someone in recovery. I hurt myself and others. I was arrested multiple times. I lost jobs and educational opportunities and nearly my life. I was blessed by good fortune and a lot of probably dumb luck to receive treatment in 2013 that I wouldn't have been able to access otherwise. It was my third attempt at inpatient. It took me about 7 months, and it brought me into the recovery that I'm enjoying today. And since entering recovery, since this new lease on life, I've tried my best to leverage my experiences and to use this in a meaningful way, the things that have happened to me and the things that I've done. So to that end, I came back to Vermont. I went to UVM and graduated. I'm currently employed there now and working towards my master's in public administration. And my first few years in recovery were mostly spent in silence. The treatment regimen I had participated in really encouraged a lot of quiet reflection and introspection, keeping oneself on the right path. And while doing that, I was also having to live in reality. And the thing about reality and this overdose crisis is the deaths haven't stopped in the past few years, or at least since beginning my own recovery. And I think what's been the hardest part about this second chapter of my substance use disorder story hasn't been abstaining from use, but has really been the fact that the fantastic connections and friendships I made throughout treatment and recovery, many of the first meaningful relationships I've had in my life, I've had to watch people not enjoy the same success I've had, while I haven't had a recurrence of my substance use disorder, and while I've got to enjoy the many things I thought would never have been possible while in active addiction, I've watched my friends struggle to find help and ultimately die. And so eventually, I think it was about October 2017, another friend passed. And that was the moments that I decided to start bringing my recovery, my advocacy out publicly. And so I've started to really leverage my personal experience to inform policymakers about the things that I think could improve the lives of people in our own community and people with substance use disorder and for community safety generally. And so to that end, I've fought for things like overdose prevention sites, and I was asked to participate or help in the process of drafting a resolution that was passed by the city council last summer that ultimately allowed us to consider in some way the option of overdose prevention sites here in Burlington. And that resolution also put a new community member, someone with lived experience, on CompStat. So I've been attending CompStat for about 6 months now, since September of last year, and part of the thing I'd like to do tonight is really report out on some of the discussions I've been part of and some of the things that we've been doing here in Burlington, because if you haven't heard the news, we have, for the first time in my lifetime, good news to discuss. The fact is that there was a press release last month that opioid-related overdoses, fatalities dropped by 50% this past year in Chittenden County alone. Unfortunately, they rose throughout the rest of the state. The reason we saw such a precipitous drop relative to the rest of the state is because of 3 interventions that were really championed by the partners in CompStat. One, the decriminalization of buprenorphine. We're no longer arresting or charging people who possess a medication for opioid use disorder despite not having a prescription. We've also lowered barriers to getting those prescriptions by having someone available in our syringe exchange to provide prescriptions as soon as people are ready for treatment. And we're also providing fentanyl test strips, so people who are choosing to still use drugs can do so a bit more safely, understand their risk. And those interventions have been fantastic, and while it's hard to point to any causal relationship there, it's pretty clear that we're doing a whole lot of things right in Chittenden County, and that's exciting. And I think the challenge in the next year or so will really be looking at how that progress continues or doesn't, and then where that leads us to consider our next set of policy interventions. Maybe it's time to think about overdose prevention sites in the future, but for now, I think it's fine to take heart in the fact that we're doing a lot of great things here in Chittenden and Burlington, and things that certainly would have helped me while in active addiction and would have helped my friends. So that's a little bit about who I am and what I've been doing. And while I'm certainly prepared to pitch to you all my great ideas for solving this crisis, and I've got a few, one thing that occurred to me far too late in this process is the idea of, yes, community representative. Which is not a role I've filled in the past 6 months because, as far as I know, you weren't aware I was representing you or the community. So, hello, I'm Scott, by the way. Nice to meet you. But to that end, I'd like to sort of turn the tables now. I'll continue to sit here. You can remain in your seats. But I would like to hear any questions, concerns you may have about this broad issue generally, as well as any ideas for solutions, anything I can answer or relay up the chain. Yeah.
God, could you describe what an overdose prevention site is?
Sure. So an overdose prevention site, and this might speed everyone along if I just call it a safe injection site instead. And I see a few nods. Okay. So an overdose prevention site, that idea would be laws on the books be damned, federal disagreement be damned, that if you have a substance use disorder that leads you to stick a needle in your body multiple times a day to get well, you can do so under the protection of medical professionals. The idea of replicating these treatment facilities that are pretty widespread throughout Canada, some places in Europe, Australia, where just allowing people with substance use disorder the ability to use and test their substances in a safe environment and ultimately reverse overdoses that do occur in those environments. When we're talking about something that is killing 70,000 Americans a year, it strikes me as a common sense idea. Wasn't planning on going down this road tonight, but that's something that I've definitely pushed for in my advocacy, especially when you lose as many loved ones and friends and neighbors as we have. You start to think about radical ideas, and that's something that's really grown on me over the years.
John?
Thank you very much for doing this, Scott, and for helping to educate people like me who, don't have the experience that you have. But as I think you know, the Burlington High School debate team actually debated overdose or safe injection sites, and the safe injection sites, one, you can't drive to them or from them. And they questioned how much people would actually use them and access them. And for the money that you would spend doing something like that, is there not a better use of funds, given the small, just a very small group that could make it work? Or it might not even be a group, it might be a very few people, and they wouldn't even use it all the time necessarily.
Yeah, so we're going down that road tonight, I guess, everybody. Certainly a lot to unpack there. First thing to start with right away, driving to and from sites. We let people drive away from bars. This would be staffed by medical professionals. I think we can get people to a level of functioning that we can be confident in their ability to drive away. But thinking about the rural problem here in Burlington, Burlington would definitely be a different beast when talking about establishing one of those sites, and it's certainly easier to see the argument for one based on the conventional models that we're usually referencing in places like Canada, thinking about a stable brick and mortar location with set hours. Certainly when we think about the clientele who are already using safe recovery from multiple areas across the state, and the reputation and relationships that safe recovery has throughout the community, I think it's easy to see plenty of scenarios where it'd be a viable option for many of that population. Talking about throughout the state elsewhere, yeah, dropping safe injection sites in some places might be helpful. Places like Barrie, I could see it being helpful. And certainly, sorry, something exploding in my pocket. Okay, that was hot. But certainly places elsewhere, rural Vermont, I could see where it wouldn't make a difference at all, where it might not be as a brick and mortar site particularly accessible or really addressing a whole lot of people's needs. And in those scenarios, you say, what about mobile sites? What about, if we're going to dream broadly and bigly, what about meeting people where they're at geographically, not just where they are in the recovery process? So there's certainly many arguments against these sites, and that's partly why I'm so heartened by the fact that our interventions here in Burlington and Chittenden County have been making so much progress. But yeah, there are questions, and certainly that's why I was so enthusiastic that the City Council was going to be exploring overdose prevention sites. I hope that happens soon.
We're going to be moving out of Burlington soon, and so to the country. And so the question is, why is it worse in the rural areas, and we continue to get even worse as we go on?
So I think the worst comparison right now might be based on where opioid-related fatalities are occurring relative to the state. So we're seeing increases in southern counties and drops in Chittenden County, and that's why I think it's safe to say worse. Why that's happening, there's a lot of speculation. I don't have a clear, good answer. There's speculations as to differences in the interventions here in terms of the accessibility of buprenorphine and whether or not there's stigma among first responders or among law enforcement in addressing any unsanctioned or unprescribed possession of buprenorphine. But certainly it's hard to say, and that's one of the reasons why we're hoping to replicate the success we've had here elsewhere. So please bring our messages to the country.
You said that you had a whole laundry list of things you thought would be good ideas, and I know you probably can't go into all of them right now, but could you give a list of things that are good keywords to look up on our own, or potentially give your email out so we can just get a extended list of those ideas?
Yeah, I think the email's the way to go there. Yeah, that's right. I'll give you guys my email. My email is Scott with 2 T's. .Pavek, Pavek @gmail.com.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Spencer?
Yeah, I was wanting to go back a little bit and thinking about people in their middle age and
So maybe,
Why do young people go for this? Is it's in the culture, people talk about it as a great thing, they get it cheaply? You've been through that, so you should know.
I should. I wish I did. I wish I did. Why we have broadly a substance use disorder crisis.
Well, why did you start your case?
Certainly. Well, I think before getting into that, it's quick to take a step back and really appreciate the framing that we have a substance use disorder crisis here in America, and we're talking about the public effects of alcohol use disorder are through the roof, especially relative to opioid use disorder. And you're also talking to, fortunately, unfortunately, someone lucky enough to have both. So when we're talking about why people seek out substances, I think I'm not entirely alone in the fact that we talk about an opioid crisis or an overdose or opioid epidemic. But really, at least for my generation, the people that I grew up with and the people who continue to be affected in active addiction here in Vermont, it really wasn't necessarily about opioids. Opioids was the product of the time when talking about then when I started my experimentation with drugs, it was a matter of overprescription, and there were too many opioids on the market. And that was about 10, 12 years ago now. Had it been something else, when you're that bored, anxious, lonely, and poor, you would have found something else. So certainly we were taking whatever we could get at the time. And I think it's just that combination of the moment and the generation. Sure.
Any other questions for Scott? Sorry, was there another? Yes.
What is this? It's ComStat or?
ComStat?
Yeah, what is it?
So that's this is based in the CompStat model that I think was born out of the New York City Police Department in the 80s or 90s. And the theory here, it's run through the Burlington Police Community Statistics, I believe. I might have the stat part wrong, which would be super embarrassing. But ComStat, and so community statistics, and what we're really doing is bringing department heads and agency representatives from a whole swath of organizations across Chittenden County to meet on a regular basis and share metrics that are really being used to direct policy. So on a pretty regular basis, taking a lay of the landscape and asking, okay, how does this direct where we go next? And just in my 6 months, I was brought in under the aegis of one particular issue and seen a lot of progress elsewhere. Things like promoting access to treatment in prisons and jails was absolutely done by the champions that are in that room at ComStat, and that's been a fantastic change just in the past six months or so that's really making a difference here in Vermont. So you have my contact information. Please ask me anything, tell me anything. If you have stories or experiences that you didn't have a chance to share tonight, please relay those. I would love to, if at all possible, share them with policymakers who might not be hearing them on a regular basis, but happy to be a resource as I can be. Thanks for the time tonight.
Thanks so much, Scott. So next up on the agenda is Burlington School District. We wanted to dedicate a good chunk of this conversation to the pre-K task force, but we also have our school commissioner here, Mike Fisher, who was nice enough to sneak over from a school board meeting that's happening right now. So I thought we could give him just a few minutes up front and then switch over to pre-K task force. So thanks, Mike.
Thank you. So I do want to come over because I know that there's a lot going on in the district, and I know that especially there's a lot of media attention, and I've been getting a lot of email about the principal hirings. And so I want to just talk briefly about it, and then I'll open it up for questions. So this is my first year on the board, and we've done very little. There hasn't been a lot of hiring decisions, but as we look at the policy, it is the superintendent who recommends the hire. The board is responsible for actually doing the hiring of all licensed professionals, including the building administrators, the principals. So the board does have final signatory, but the superintendent is responsible for the process to pick and to recommend. And the board has been deliberating of how much we get into the hiring process. I know that some community members want the board to have more say and to have more information when we're given the decision to sign off. And there is no right answer. It is a dilemma but the policies and the law says that the superintendent gives the information to the board. We've listed out, just last year, said, okay, here's some information that we want, but I know that there's a lot of discussion that we should get more information. To date, the decisions that have been made so far is we got a recommendation for the Flint principal, for LaShawn Whitmore-Sells, who is currently the principal of SA. The board last week declined to the recommendation of the superintendent to hire her as the Flynn principal. The BHS principal search had a number of candidates. Most of those candidates dropped out due to signing with other school districts. Part of that is timing. We are late in the season, and part of that is because we wanted to do additional vetting with staff and community members. So that puts we didn't start early enough to do that in timing to compete with other districts. So we did have the principal, the BHS forum last night, 2 nights ago, something like that, where interim principal Noel Green spoke, and he's the only candidate. And he's being put forward tonight, probably as we speak, as the candidate to have the full-time job. And so I don't know what's going to happen. So that's enough talking for me. I'll open it up for questions.
Mike, why did this process get started so late in terms of principal hiring?
I don't know. So some of the principal hirings, right, there's elementary school principals that are that positions. Some of that movement, people wanted to, there's a request to transfer, that just happened recently. In terms of the VHS principal hiring, the district knew that we wanted to hire a permanent principal in July. So why did it start when it did, or I don't have an answer.
Over here.
There have been talk on a lot of the listservs that I'm a part of, the PTO listservs, about why there was a group listing for the elementary school principals, and has anything been done about making them individuals so that we can attract principals to those positions?
So
the group grab bag isn't really effective in attracting.
So the rationale for that is efficiency, right? So that if we can get a pool of candidates that we can say do a group vetting, that is more efficient than doing maybe the same candidate at 2 different schools or 3 different elementary schools. So because we're, again, late in the season, there is a need to move expeditiously. And the proposal to do the group bunching them up was approved by the board as a way to make the process efficient and not miss potentially a good candidate.
The arguments, though, are that it's making it less attractive. So, for example, if there's a principal out there who's very interested in the arts magnet or in a certain neighborhood, they're maybe not going to apply because they're in a grab bag situation where they get, like, for example, I think I heard LaShawn was interested in Flint originally and got placed at Champlain, and is now a year, or no, that's not right. She got placed at SA, and now a year later is maybe being moved, 2 years later being moved to Flint, so.
Well, I understand the concern, but there's the other way. I mean, there's no right or wrong. It's a dilemma, right? So we decided that we needed to move, and that bundling was the best solution. It's not perfect. There are no perfect solutions. A teacher, a principal who gets an offer to a school that they don't like doesn't have to accept it, right? So I do understand that maybe the optics weren't great, but we didn't want to delay the potential of hiring a good candidate and lose them to another district.
Mike, can you just give us a really quick, if you have it, status update of the principal hiring at Champlain here in our ward and at IAA?
So Champlain and IAA and SA are the ones that are being bundled. So bundled candidate pool, there's a session set up at Hunt for, I think, later this month. The Champlain principal is there's a search advisory team of district staff and leaders who are in charge of the detailed vetting of that candidate, and there's community forums to gather that input. There are no, I know the question came up, why is there not a parent on the search advisory team? Superintendent Obeng has chosen not to have parents on any search advisory team. Some of his rationale is that you need to take anti-bias training to make sure that, anti-bias training, and that's just the decision he has made to include administrators, other principals, and staff, and not just from that school, so that Doug Woods from Champlain participated in the Flint search advisory team. So the process, to go back to your question, the process for IAA and Champlain are all going to be bundled and vet those candidates as a group. Okay. Yeah.
Has there been any luck in moving that meeting from Hunt to like Gilman Bend, or?
I understand that there's been requests, but there's, as far as I know, the meeting's still at, the forum's still at Hunt. Okay.
So if I could just ask one question.
Sure.
It seems like a very high level of turnover among leaders among our district. And so when you talk about recruitment and retention, obviously, recruitment is one part of it, but retention is another. And so maybe it's a big question and you don't have time to answer, but from your position on the school board, even if we're able to recruit good candidates, do you have any concerns about our ability to then retain them given the level of turnover that we're seeing right now?
So some of the openings, it's a very good question, very tough question. Some of the openings are not, I don't think are due to the district. So like the Flint principal retiring, right? Or the principal at IAA wanting to do a transfer and do something new after 8 years, right? I think that's natural part. I do think that the district has had some rough times lately, right? We have a reputation for various reasons. We've had a teacher strike. Principals see what's going on, candidates see what's going on. So we do worry about retention. And so I agree with you, hiring is one thing, retaining is another. And if we look at all of the principals across the district, only Shelley Mathias at EES has any long tenure. And that's, to me, is a negative indicator of what's going on in this district. And on that lovely note, I gotta run and get my phone's getting blown up. Thank you for talking about the early A. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Yeah.
And so it's Tracy, I believe, right?
Yep.
Okay, so we have Tracy here from the pre-K task force, and so the rest of Mike left on that lovely note. Hopefully we can talk about a group right now here.
Yeah. So thanks for having me. I think somebody on the steering committee requested an update on pre-K program. So I'm a parent in the district, and I don't know how much history you all have. You probably have quite a bit because Champlain was a potential site for a new building. A lot happened last spring to move this early education changes forward, and there wasn't much storytelling or engagement happening along the way. I was a parent in that phase that kind of threw my hands up and said, hold on a second, nobody knows about this, and it's ground is gonna be broken in July. And so luckily the school board agreed to put a halt on it. One of the things that the school board did in October was to pass a plan to form a task force. And so the task force has been meeting since November, and I joined it as a parent. I have a 5th grader and a preschooler, and I feel strongly that equity and access need to be a part of the future of that program. And so my concerns were closing down the neighborhood schools and having to bus more kids out of their neighborhoods, and access for parents to those programs. And so that's where I came from into this process. What the task force has been doing is having a lot of meetings around what's been done, investigating why some of the decisions were made and the thinking behind it, this kind of the story that wasn't told. We're working on some documents to present that information in a more of a, a concise way. We've also been drafting a survey, which is out as of the end of February, and the survey was opened up to the entire community. And so the goal of the survey is to find out what we value in the early education program as citizens of the city, because our early learners affect everybody, right? This is the foundation that we're starting with. What do we value? What do we need as a community for these kids? We have a lot of working families. Does what we offer in the Burlington public school system serve those families, or are there other needs that are preventing people from accessing the services? What does the wait list look like, and who's on it, and why is there a wait list, and can we fix that? And if we built new buildings, for example, would that solve the wait list, or maybe not? Maybe those people are on the wait list because their needs aren't being met by what we're offering. So we're basically, the survey is trying to gather a lot of information. So help us spread the word about filling it out. It's open to every Burlington resident, every community member, teachers, parents, citizens, everybody. And so hopefully we're going to get voices and input, and that is going to be something that the task force takes and kind of lays over the top of the information that we've been gathering. What's available in the area, like what are the restraints on resources, what are some alternatives, and then we are going to come out to the NPAs and the PTO meetings and other gatherings that are already scheduled, and have discussions and ask for feedback about those potential plans. But we're not really prepared to offer ideas out to discuss until we gather the information from the public. So fill out the survey. I think it's the schedule, the timeline is still sort of not fully approved by the rest of the task force, but I think it will be open until the first Friday in April. I think we're thinking like April 3rd or something, maybe that's a Wednesday. And then we'll spend, as a task force, we'll spend quite a few weeks trying to pull it all together and figure out what do we value, what can we do with the resources we have, and put out a presentation. So the goal is to get out here in May in full force and hit all the meetings that we can, gather the feedback, tweak the plans, and hopefully by the June board have something to recommend to Yao and the board for what the community wants to see happen and what the community would support. And that might look like a hybrid. It might look completely different from what the district has done already. It might be that we have to take baby steps. I think the task force is recognizing that there's a lot of restraints in resources. But hearing from residents and not just parents about the building sites, for example, is important, and there needs to be space for that. So we're trying to make the space for the engagement. So that's where we're at, and so hopefully we have something to recommend to the board in June. I think it's June 11th is the June board meeting. So that's kind of our trajectory right now. Does anybody have any questions?
I actually just wanted to riff on something. So Tracy is underselling her and the PTO task force have done really amazing and important work. I think a lot of you might be aware that I helped with a lot of criticism with the capital plan that the school board did, or the district did last year, and part of their response, much to their credit, was to create this task force. I know Tracy said that briefly, but if they're trying to double back and say, okay, what does the community need? What do you guys want? And so for the survey, all parents should be filling it out, not just kids, not just families with little kids. Everyone should be filling it out so the city can kind of get a handle on what do we need. And this task force is doing the survey and studying all the alternatives. It's just awesome. So please tell a lot of people about it. And I think the task force, I'm like typically on it, Tracy's doing like 50,000 times more work than I am. And so it's really important for like everyone to be filling it out, and not just like people who are like me. So
Yeah, we need to hear from everybody. And there's we recognize as a task force, the district is helping us push this out through their avenues. But we recognize that there's it's really difficult to reach parents of 0 to 5 because they're really exhausted by having little ones, right? And they're not necessarily coming to NPAs. And they're not necessarily checked into district information. They're not necessarily reading Front Porch Forum. You know, they're just starting to connect to the community in different ways as parents. And so if you know people in the city who have children that are that little, like, tell them about the survey. Tell them to go to the district website, and there's an early education survey. It takes less than 15 minutes. And
Give us the information.
yeah, there's some flyers on the back table, and
I live in the co-op across the street, there are a lot of children there.
right, that would be wonderful to
I'll
take
put
that
the link
there.
on the NPA Facebook page too, and I'll tweet it out of
Mhm.
my handle as well.
Yeah, if you go to the district homepage, it's bsdvt.org, and down a little bit in the news feed, there's a link to it as well. So help us spread the word. 2 more minutes. Any more questions?
Did you have a question?
I just wanted to look at it.
Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, as a parent of a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old, I took the survey, and it didn't take all that long. You know, it's about
Yeah.
10 minutes or so, and it's very comprehensive, and I thought it was really well put together, so thanks for doing that.
Thanks for filling it out.
Yeah.
More, please. The last I heard was about a week, maybe a week ago. Russ from the district PR staff let me know. I think there were like 150 that had been filled out. So we really need a representative sample, you know, and that's not it. So more. Yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions for Tracy? Okay, thanks so much. All right, so as folks here know, both here at the NPA as well as obviously in community discussions, there's been some discussions about the Burton proposal with respect to one of their facilities there along Industrial Parkway. We have Justin Worthley here. He was nice enough to join us a couple months ago. But for this meeting, we wanted to sort of get one of the other voices here, and we wanted to bring back in some folks from planning and zoning. So we have, as I mentioned, Harris, our Ward 5 Planning Commissioner, as well as we have City Planner Megan Tuttle, and one of our other planning commissioners as well. So if they could come up, and just wanted to get some feedback on what's going on here in the neighborhood, as well as with respect to the proposal we've been discussing. So thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Want to introduce, so I'm Harris, and live here in Ward 5, and I was glad when I got invited to talk about this from the Planning Commission perspective. Megan Tuttle is Planning Commission staff, and Alex Friend is on the Planning Commission and is also chair of the Ordinance Committee on the Planning Commission, so deals with these ordinance changes a lot, as do we all. So I'll hand it off to Megan, who's talked about this in a whole bunch of other forms as well, so is pretty prepared to kind of say, what the, kind of how we came to the decision, or why we went into this decision, basically. And then maybe at the end, I'll get into how the commission specifically got to it, and Alex can chime in too about the DRB or whatever else, yeah.
Thank you for having us. We have talked about this amendment. You may have heard of it referred to as an amendment with a number or with a name called commercial uses in the ELM, the Enterprise District. That's the zoning district that represents a lot of the south end along Pine Street, essentially the part of the neighborhood that's not in a residential neighborhood. This is a part of the city where we've had a lot of study in recent years with the Plan B TV South End, but also from the Planning Commission's perspective is a place where we've heard a lot of questions and we've had a lot of issues raised for us about the evolving nature of this neighborhood and how the regulations that govern the Enterprise District today don't imagine and don't represent a lot of the business models that have emerged in the South End over the past 10 years or more, particularly as the nature of industry and manufacturing has changed. we've seen a lot of new and kind of evolving businesses. So over the past several years, we've received quite a few requests for the Planning Commission and ultimately the City Council to consider some amendments to that zoning that would enable certain businesses that have either been longstanding businesses in the neighborhood or emerging businesses in the neighborhood to evolve along Pine Street or within the South End as a whole. In the recent months, we've received a number of these requests, which are the subject of this current amendment that the Planning Commission has been considering. Those include the request to allow banks within the Enterprise District. We presently do not allow banks in the district. And then we'd also received a couple of requests related to performing arts venues. Both Arts Riot in their present location with an interest in adapting their current facility to better meet their needs, with some needs for more space that currently would not be allowed under the ordinance, as well as the proposal that you heard about a couple of months ago with Burton and looking at the next generation of their business model and seeing some synergies with that kind of use in their facility. So when we received these requests, the Planning Commission felt that it was really appropriate for us to consider the entire context of what Plan BTV, our plan for the South End, talks about in terms of the evolving nature of the Enterprise District. And especially when we think about that part of the district that's south of Home Avenue really being a place that has been long characterized as still a remaining truly industrial neighborhood. We were interested in trying to find a solution that considered the requests of those businesses that were being brought forward to us, but also looked at the kind of long-term viability of that part of the neighborhood as an industrial neighborhood. How do we provide some flexibility for the evolution of those businesses without unintentionally creating zoning for that part of the neighborhood that makes it such a exciting place to have almost a second downtown that we don't see industry anymore within that part of the district. And that was really the challenge that the Planning Commission and the staff were working on as part of this amendment. And so the amendment that has been proposed and forwarded by the Planning Commission to the City Council tries to balance those issues. We recognize that in order for industry to thrive in the South End, especially traditional kind of manufacturing and industrial uses, we need to be more flexible in terms of allowing them to do the kind of maker activities that their industries are asking them for. As well as allow them to kind of partner up with other more traditional types of commercial uses that can, quite frankly, help them pay the bills and help them afford to stay in their spaces where they want to work and be producing in the South End. So that's the first part of the amendment, is that we consider a number of what we call more traditional commercial uses, things like a performing arts venue or a bank or some office spaces that maybe had some limitations before in the South End, to be allowed in a more broad way within the neighborhood to support those industrial and manufacturing uses. But then we also recognize that, like I said before, we don't want these uses to kind of just run away with us and really transform the nature of the South End into something that it hasn't been in the past. So when we think about the part of the district south of Home Avenue, one of the things that we really wanted to prioritize was how we can try to preserve some of that industrial flavor and those industrial type businesses. So the amendment proposes that when we want to see something like an office or a cafe or a performing arts venue or some other kind of traditional commercial use, that it needs to really be in support of industry, that it needs to happen on the same lot as industry. And so the amendment says that, no more than half of the uses on a particular property can be these sort of traditional uses, that we really have to maintain at least half of them as some kind of industrial or manufacturing use. Ultimately, that is kind of the amendment in a nutshell. I know that through the Planning Commission's process, we did have some questions about, how do we consider certain types of uses and where they're allowed in the South End. And I think that one of the big things for the Planning Commission's consideration was how these uses kind of relate to one another. Are they happening, is a performing arts venue kind of happening freestanding on its own anywhere within the district? Or is it happening as a part of something else, kind of in conjunction with something else? And that's really how we set this amendment up to be structured. I think you can probably speak a little bit more to some of the things that the Planning Commission thought about.
Yeah, we had a question. Did you have a question? Yeah.
I have a question. You say south of Home Avenue, I'm thinking how much of Burlington is south of Home Avenue? Not much, except what's already built up. So I'm not sure, are you just talking about the Burton area there?
Well, yeah, and just to be clear, we're really only talking about the industrial district south of Home Ave. So that would be Burton and Edland and, those companies there. Basically, Rhino.
Mountain Transit Association,
Yeah.
four major landowners. It's really, what is it, bordered between Home Avenue and Industrial Avenue and Queen City Park Road.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's the area.
We should be clear, that's the area that we're talking about, this kind of relationship where if you wanted to, if a property owner wanted to bring in, some sort of traditional commercial space or a performing arts venue, they would have to do it in conjunction with some kind of an industrial use. That same limitation doesn't apply in the entire district. So this is something that through Plan B TV's analysis of the South End and some of the identities of the South End, this was a place where we felt we really needed to focus on the preservation of industry, which is why that relationship would apply in that place.
What do you consider an industrial use? I'm just trying to think. I mean, can you give some examples?
Well, yeah, there's actually a whole table of allowed industrial uses, which I don't know off the top of my head, but maybe, yeah.
I can provide some examples. So, anything from the traditional kind of making, refining materials and products, producing products like we would think of traditionally as an industrial kind of use, but also things like we know prototyping or laboratories to test products. We also know that there are industrial uses and that we would allow through this amendment that are things like, taking a raw material and making it into a product. So producing beer or cider or some other kind of food product could even be an industrial type use. There are also quite a few industrial uses that really blend the line between art and industry. So you think about things like photography or sculpture making or woodworking. Those are examples of things that are kind of on the edge between industry and art.
Yeah, and that, the challenge at the Plan Commission was, to look at this and, kind of unique area of Burlington where, industry does happen and should happen, and balance that with the fact that it's hard to get industrial uses to come there. Most places are going to set up, outside of Burlington. It's just been extremely hard. So how do we move forward, considering that? So, it's kind of the balance we struck. Well, you can't have, just a restaurant, for example. But if that's part of, complementing the industrial use that's already there in the same building, then yeah, it's okay. So we don't want to turn into, another Church Street, but, we have to face the economic reality too. Yeah.
Well, you're talking about it and you're making it sound very interesting in the fact of bringing in a small cafe or something like that that would go along with the business that's there, some kind of small side thing. The proposal that's coming forward is higher ground coming in with potentially 1,200 people coming into a performance.
Yeah.
I think there's a bit of a disconnect between a small little venue and maybe, say, a photography studio or an art studio, maybe having a small show once in a while, to 3 nights a week having 500 cars show up and be there till quite late or early in the morning. There's a big disconnect in my mind,
Yeah.
God knows. And I think the other thing we have to think about is, yes, there's an industrial surrounded, directly adjacent neighborhoods, houses, right abutters.
Yeah.
And for example, in our case, we're in waterfront residential. If I wanna change the color of my front door, I have to get a permit. Rhino Foods just did a major expansion. They could cut down half the trees on their site, and that's no problem, and they did.
Yeah.
There's a huge disconnect in the use of property, and they are right adjacent to it, and that's not your fault. That's a fault that was made 40-some years ago when zoning first came in, that zoning uses were allowed next to each other. It was a very poor decision back then. But we need to live with that and make good decisions based on the conditions that exist right now. And the thought of, I have no problem with the skateboard park coming in the Burton building. I think the Burton Museum is great. I think having their store move over into that building is a fantastic idea. Consolidating their offices as technical offices, which is what they've been all along. That's no change in use. It's a change in definition, but not a change in use. Those are all good things. Those are no problem. The concept of a change in use, Pine Street and Arts Riot, that's a street that is constantly traveled. There are people on that road 24/7. It's got high use. If I look out my back window and I look at Industrial Parkway on a Saturday night at 8 o'clock at night, I can stand there for 10 minutes and watch one car go by. It's a huge change, and I think that's what's got to be considered.
Yeah, and I apologize for missing that point, that is what we're talking about, is a much bigger use than, just a coffee shop or a restaurant. So, and we, considered that with eyes wide open, the planning commission, what, that means. So, so thanks for correcting me on that. And bring up the challenge of having an industrial zone right next to a residential zone. It's a problem all along that industrial zone, how do you deal with that? I mean, it's a good question, but I think it is important to have a manufacturing district in Burlington and to preserve that and, deal with the adjacency questions the best we can.
Yeah, I think the thing that I wanted to speak to too about what you're mentioning about, the impact of certain uses and what it means in the context in which they're located. So in our zoning ordinance, there are some uses in Burlington where we say, yes, you can do this here. There's, no caveats to that. Yes, you can do that here. There are other places where we say, no, you can't do that at all. And then there are other places where we say, we're going to conditionally allow this. And what that means is that when that use is conditionally allowed, it goes to the Development Review Board automatically. And the Development Review Board reviews any proposal for a project of that use against a number of criteria. They look at things like, what are the traffic impacts going to be? What are the impacts on the community's infrastructure, whether that's roads or sewers or any other kind of utilities? They look at things like the character and compatibility of the area. In some cases, that might be a question of, is this use in character if it's this size versus this size, or is that use in character at all? Those are the kinds of questions that the DRB then, through their review process, would actually ask and answer when they would consider a specific proposal for something.
Having gone through that procedure many times in the South End, what I can tell you is that the DRB basically says, unless it is specifically prohibited, unless it comes to a very high bar that there is a conflict, then it's allowed. And I've seen it over and over and over again. So that idea of conditional use, that bar is really, really high for a conflict that 99% of the time is going to get approved. Conditional use doesn't slow things down that much.
Right, and it may not necessarily say, no, not at all, this can't happen, but what it does allow for are modifications or conditions, looking at a traffic study and maybe setting hours of operation or setting other limitations that can help mitigate potential impacts as a result of certain uses, is, to your point, is more of a likely scenario through that process.
No, I was just gonna say, that you say something about conditional use.
Sure, yep.
Not about conditional use.
Conditional use sounds like temporary to me. And it's-
Oh,
so it's not-
no.
I realize, but it's not a very clear.
Yeah. It just means that before we say that it can be permitted, it goes through an extra level of review to evaluate against all those criteria we talked about. What is the impact that this use might have on the area in which it's located? So.
Understanding there needs to be a employee, but
Mhm.
that building, run that lab. My concerns with the tail wagging the dog here. Burlington zoning seems to be driven by developers, not the other way around. And, we've lived in this house 26 years. We've gone through the process with the Npa of saying, what does the South End want? Send that up to the city, say this is the way we'd like to see it. And, for examples like, as I remember now, it's been a long time since we looked at this, but things like a garage, a car mechanic garage, is not allowed in the industrial development. Or used to be, not allowed. It's like, what? That seems like a reasonably good fit, and it's the same kind of noisy system, and all this kind of stuff. And yet, this way, a company who's having troubles and understands the difficult situation, which I feel is already pretty much a conditional use, because that is basically an office building. Yes, there are 12 employees that work in a lab and that sort of thing. That used to be a manufacturing lab, there was manufacturing. But now it's basically an office building. So I already figured it's conditional, as far as I'm concerned, as far as industrial goes. To get them to survive, and we want to keep them, of course, but to offer them, let them bring in this thing that's radically different than this zone was ever intended to be. I mean, you don't allow a bank there. You don't allow, bicycle repair, garages and things like this. So it seemed like, at least in the bicycle repair sites, like a pretty good fit. But then to allow a venue for all night kind of stuff, like I said, Church Street. Why does this suddenly fit? And again, I feel like it's the tail wagging the dog here. That yes, they want to stay, understand perfectly. Yes, they're having monetary problems with doing that. And this is an option. Somebody came to them and said, hey, we can use this space for this. It'd be a great fit. And now we change the zoning to allow. What's the point of having zoning? We're going to let it change that easily, that quickly, and that drastically.
I don't think, my name's Alex Friend, I'm planning commissioner, I live in Henry Street in Ward 1. We're not appointed by ward or anything, but I wanted to come tonight because we talked about this at 2 different planning commission meetings, and a lot of you were there. We heard from a range of people, people who live in the neighborhood, some people who oppose it, some people who are in favor of it. So we're here to talk about the zoning and not about the project specifically. And I appreciate what you said. I don't think we change this quickly or without much thought. The idea is to accommodate the changing nature of manufacturing while we're still retaining a manufacturing zone, an industrial zone in Burlington, and recognizing that, yes, this one particular landowner's mix of manufacturing has changed such that it's more office space. It's a difficult issue to weigh. And for instance, with Arts Riot, they were permitted years ago, I think before I was on the planning commission, before Megan was there, to have a performing arts space. And that's sort of a funny change to allow one property to have a performing arts feature. This change would apply to, would it be in the entire district, or at least south of Home Avenue?
The entire district.
So the idea is to somehow, the way Megan has drafted the ordinance change, is to attach, essentially we would make these other permitted uses like performing arts subordinate to the larger one. So it'd still have to be 51% office space, for instance, that's one example. 51% industrial, 49% office space. So it's a difficult issue to weigh, but I appreciate that. I live in a college neighborhood. I got a lot of street noise too. And I just wanted to mention that among the permitted uses now, one of them is warehouse and distribution operation. And so that would be probably the most logical thing that would go in there. You'd have a lot more trucks driving down Home Avenue, and that would be permitted now without any change in zoning. Megan?
I appreciate your comments, and I just wanted to kind of speak to a couple of the things that that you had mentioned about not being allowed in this part of the neighborhood. And in the case of this amendment, we haven't proposed to change anything that is currently allowed to not being allowed. The only thing that happens as a result of this change is to say that there are what we call kind of a bucket of uses that are, your typical cafe, your just plain old generic office space, performing arts venues, things like that, that really could be anywhere in the city. They don't have to be specific to Industrial Parkway, and said that, if we want to put those on Industrial Parkway, they have to be in support of those industrial uses. So we haven't taken away the ability for a property on Industrial Parkway to just do warehousing or just do manufacturing or bicycle repair, or any of those things. Those are all still things that are allowed very intentionally. But yes, we do receive dozens of requests every year for us to consider provisions of the zoning ordinance, and that's for a variety of reasons. In some cases, we receive them, from a business owner or a property owner who, has an idea or has a specific challenge, and they want to present a solution for us to consider. In other cases, it's because of a study or a policy that the city has been working on, and we need to make changes in order to advance some of the goals of that study. We also know that there are things that happen over time, that our community is constantly evolving, and not everything that happens today in Burlington or might happen in the next few years or many years is anticipated today in our zoning ordinance. And so this is a process for us to consider what changes are happening in our community, are being asked to happen in our community, and whether or not they're appropriate. So that's why we use this Planning Commission to help us weigh these issues.
Just to talk about the process a little bit, shouldn't be fast. It's supposed to go slow, but it does allow for change because, the situation does change. I hope, Burlington doesn't get locked into the same zoning forever. So the process is slow and deliberative, or at least should be. And first review it in the Planning Commission, often first at the Ordinance Committee level, and then the full commission level. Then it goes to the City Council, usually to the Ordinance Committee, which you're not on, Joan, are you? I wish Chip was here, but.
I am going to be on it for this.
Okay.
Chip has recused himself, but I have not been on the Ordinance Committee for a few years.
Okay, so it'll go to the City Council Ordinance Committee, and then to the full City Council. If there are any changes in those processes, it comes back to the Planning Commission again. So there's a lot of touch points still to come, and there have been already. But it is supposed to be slow and deliberative, so I hope that it is. Yeah. I'll let the moderator pick. Yeah.
So, just share a couple thoughts that Megan is now no pushover on this issue. So we actually originally approached the city on this concept almost a year ago. In a few weeks, it'll be a year when we had a first discussion with David White and the mayor.
Excuse me, I don't know who you are.
Sorry, I'm Justin Worthley from Burton.
Okay.
Been working on this project.
I thought maybe it was for.
It's an important point. And they initially said no way. That area, we really want industry in there. That's what Plant BTD South End said. And they said, would you be willing, if we can surface a industrial tenant to go into that space? And we were open to delaying. So we spent about 3 or 4 months with, when Neil Lenderville was still in the CETO job, where he was seeking other partners, and really the only viable option that surfaced was a brewery, which we weren't necessarily opposed to, but it didn't really fit with what we were also trying to do with the facility. And there's a lot of breweries in Burlington already. And there's a big waste water thing sort of growing around that, so we hard for us to accept that piece, because it does create essentially a whole new set of rules for 4 addresses on Industrial Parkway that don't exist anywhere else in the enterprise zone. The enterprise zone has been treated as one zone from a zoning rule standpoint. There's never been a delineation there before. So it does restrict what we can do in all these other properties north of Home Ave and the enterprise district. Sort of have more flexibility. So we have to maintain at least half our buildings for that industrial use as you've described. And it is changing. You know, it's kind of sort of ironic we're sitting in this building right now having this conversation, because when I went back and looked at Plan BTD South End, which is how old?
2012?
2014.
But I think it was 2014.
Yeah, you're all correct. It's not.
There's
Yeah.
3 sections. Plan BTD South End outlines 3 portions of the enterprise district, and what we're describing as this industrial manufacturing zone has a big circle, including this piece of property that we're sitting in right now, and everything south of it, which is now turned into a grocery store. It's going to be a climbing gym, and so it's like it's evolving as we speak. And I guess, you know, I don't know, I sort of take a long view. You think about the history of Burlington, that's evolved as well. It's not going to stay the same. So I know these are challenges for you guys to contend with, like how fast or how slow, and what's the pressure that you respond to. And I just want to say, like, there's been a very deliberative approach. I know, you know, Megan, you did a tremendous amount of research in other communities, and, you know, pushed back hard on, like, no, we really want to take the stand here on this industrial portion of the city. And you know, we argued hard, like, it's all left. There's been hundreds of thousands of square feet of manufacturing space that's now office, all, you know, north of us. Manufacturers have exited. It's not cost effective to manufacture products in Burlington anymore. I don't think that's great. I'm not saying it's a good thing. It just is. You know, we've had 3 huge facilities, each multiple over 100,000 square feet, that are now office space. So to sort of like draw a line at Home Ave, it's hard, but, you know, compromise we and our business neighbors were able to understand and I think work with, especially with adding a technical office component into it as well. So anyhow, that's just some thoughts.
So we've been running about 10 minutes behind. I hope that's okay for the DPW folks, so thanks. We've made time for one other question. Did you have a question, Ashley? Or?
Yeah, I was just gonna ask, like, I know part of the conditional use is, one of the things you mentioned is restricting hours of operation, and I didn't know, like, do any of those exist currently in the area south of Home Ave? Like, are there?
I don't think so. I think there might be some like individual agreements that have been worked out about certain hours of like deliveries or things like that, but I don't know that there's anything that came out of the DRB process that I know of off the top of my head.
It just seems like if Rhino Foods is also operating late and it's gonna be kind of like a noisy area back there anyway, it's kind of gonna be the nature of that area to be slightly louder, and to that end, the concert venue doesn't seem like such a bad fit from that perspective.
We worked out agreements with Rhino, and they have limited hours of operation, and limited use of their road behind the building as needed. So we've worked through some of those things. Once, just quick suggestion,
Yeah,
maybe you need to move ahead. I know you've put things out for public hearing and you've made announcements. If it hadn't been for 7 days picking up the article about what was going on, I don't think that the neighbors would know anything about it. And it's not your fault, it's very difficult to get people to get interested in public hearings. But the one suggestion I would make is, can you use plain English in your announcements? When you're announcing, we're gonna have a discussion of RLM and the conditional use or whatever, most people here, their eyes are gonna glaze over. If you can spell it out in plain English about what you're talking about, you can actually get people interested in it. And that's part of what this NPA is all about. It's a great place to find out what's happening and have a conversation. We're actually having a conversation, which usually won't occur in your meetings. And it can't, based on your rules. So, but trying to get people involved in plain English would be a wonderful.
That's a fair point.
I appreciate that, absolutely. And so as a member of the Ward 5 Npa Steering Committee, I'll also sort of own that to a certain extent. One of the reasons why we're dusting off our bylaws, as I mentioned in the very beginning of the meeting, is because one of the roles that the Steering Committee has is to notify neighbors with respect to these types of meetings on events that are potentially impacting the community. And so I think we're going to try to make a more concerted effort going forward to also assist in some translation and to be monitoring these things more often and getting notifications out there. So for example, folks are continuing to follow this. I think the next sort of formal step would be that the ordinance committee would hear it before the city council. Last I've seen, that meeting has not been scheduled yet. Is that your understanding as well, Joan?
That's correct.
Yeah.
It has not been.
Okay. So
I don't think it'll be scheduled until the next council is seated April 1st.
right.
And then the committee will be formed from new councilors. There will be changes on the committee, and so that still has to happen that week after we regroup.
Yeah, that was my assumption as well. That wouldn't happen until after the first. But we as the NPA will also continue to monitor it and let people know about the meetings. I appreciate you're all continuing to come in. Justin, I appreciate your being here as well, and I anticipate we'll continue this dialogue. So thanks very much.
Thank you.
All right, so as mentioned at the beginning, we have folks from the DPW here, namely to talk about bicycle infrastructure on Flint Avenue. So thanks for being here.
I'm gonna take a crack at something.
Yeah, I think Joe, you. Joe, is it best to plug it in on the?
I just turn it on. While we get that set up, I just want to thank everybody for allowing us to be on your agenda and have a little bit of time to talk about a timely proposal that we wanted to bring air out with you, gather some feedback. And we also asked if there was time available at the end, after presenting the proposal, doing some Q&A. We do have some other projects. The South End is going to be a really active area with infrastructure renewal, which brings a lot of benefits. It also brings some short-term impacts. So as time, and if time allows, we'll discuss that now. This doesn't have to be the end of that conversation. We're always willing to answer calls, come back, and we'll be doing some front porch forum outreach on those other projects as well. But due to the timely nature of this first one, we thought we'd focus first on that. So thanks again for having us. Right there next to your arm.
While I was getting that plugged in, I will pass around a sign-up sheet in case anybody wants to stay informed based on what we hear tonight and any decisions we may make before taking this to our Public Works Commission next month. Feel free to sign up here and we will follow up. So I'll pass that around.
Come up. Well, we come prepared, so as that happens, we're going to hand out a hard copy of the presentation. It does have everything we were going to talk about today. So I'm going to share a few of these on this side. I don't think we'll run out, but if you need another copy, you can absolutely send. My name is Rob Goulding. I'm the Public Information Manager. I'm going to turn over the discussion to my colleagues, Nicole and Elizabeth.
Hi, thanks for having us tonight. I'm Nicole Loesch, Senior Planner at Public Works.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Goringer, Associate Planner at Public Works.
So in the essence of time, I'll walk us through this while we get this loaded. We can always advance through some of those initial slides. We're here tonight to talk about a proposal for reconfiguring a bit of Flint Avenue between Shelburne Street and Briggs Street. We're bringing this forward now because we're trying to coordinate this project with some other construction activity. Last year, the water rehabilitation started on Flint Avenue. That's going to continue this year. And when that's complete, then Flint Avenue will be repaved in that section. And with the repaving, we're proposing to change some of the parking configuration and the bikeway configuration on the street. This idea really gained momentum in our walk-bike plan. It's the city's first master plan for walking and biking improvements that was approved in 2017. And one of the things we really heard in that effort was a need to improve the east-west connections for people biking. And in the South End, what we really heard is that this is important to connect Oak Ledge Park with Pine Street and Shelburne Street, to connect the waterfront and city markets, and to help make biking and routes to school a little bit easier for children getting to Champlain Elementary. So we've drafted a proposal that we brought to the Walk Bike Council last month to get their input, and so they've informed a bit of this design. We are doing some direct outreach to the businesses that are directly impacted. We met with Redstone last week. We're meeting with City Market next week. We're trying to coordinate a meeting or a conversation with the Howard Center. We mailed letters to everyone along Flint Avenue who own property and who live there or have a business there. And we sent out an advisory front porch forum notice to invite people to come tonight as well. So, no luck on the presentation. All right, we'll walk you through the options here. So what we're proposing is between Shelburne Street and Pine Street to retain parking on the north side, remove parking on the south side, and with that add an eastbound bike lane. So that would be going from Pine Street to Shelburne Street, and then just have shared lane markings next to the parking lane. We're evaluating a potential crosswalk at Richardson Street as well to make it easier to get from the south side of the street to where parking will be on the north side. And then moving east, so between Pine Street and Foster, we're proposing to basically build a parking lane in place of the green belt where cars are currently parking near the Howard Center. So they park kind of adjacent to the sidewalk. We're proposing to reconstruct the sidewalk, add curbing, and just formalize the parking that's already happening there. We'd continue to sort of notch in that parking as far as we can to the west. And with that, we can add bike lanes in both directions. So there would be no parking on the south side in that block either. And then the next block, kind of where we are, very close to here, between Foster and Briggs. Oh, perfect. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Between Foster and Briggs, we would restrict parking on both sides through there and continue the bike lanes in each direction. The reason we opted for that configuration in the block is the Champlain Parkway is still planned to start construction this fall. When it's starting in the north and moving south, and by the time the parkway is constructed, basically an intersection is going to be where that block is, and so the parking is going to be removed. It's going to be just east of where we are now. So there's sort of the undeveloped parcel across Briggs Street next to City Market, and that's where the Champlain Parkway is going to come through. So we have a graphic of kind of what we're proposing here to make this a little bit easier and visual. So let's see, so this is from Pine Street to Shelburne Street. We'd have parking on just the north side, no parking on the south side, bike lane headed in that direction, and just shared lane markings headed in this direction. This is the area we're looking at adding a crosswalk. And then through this stretch, we would have bike lanes in both directions, continuing from Pine to City Market. Or, the intersection at Briggs Street, just at City Market. And we'd build the parking into the north side of the street. We have more detailed plans on the following slides if you want to get into that much detail. I guess the one thing I'll point out is it does have the bike lane and parking dimensions in there. We are retaining the trees that are in the green belt, so we're not going to impact the trees that are there, and we're working around utility poles. So there will be a couple of little notched in areas rather than one large swath of notched in parking. We're here tonight because we wanted to hear the neighborhood's thoughts on this proposal. We are planning to bring any potential parking changes to the Public Works Commission at their April meeting, which is on April 17th. And this gives us the next several weeks to make any changes to the plans based on what we're hearing. We are looking forward to your input tonight. If anybody watching this or anybody who received a letter that you know of, any of your neighbors would like to get us feedback after, our contact information is on here as well. Feel free to email us or call us. And we'll follow up with anybody who has reached out to share what our plan is for the April meeting in case we do make changes. We can walk through the plans in more detail if you'd like, but otherwise we're just happy to take any comments or questions.
And I'm not completely sure what the advantage of a share lane is.
Mm-hmm.
As a biker, it basically just seems like I'm sharing the lane with cars, which is not a very fair sharing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, So I'm wondering what it would take to have bike lanes on both
Mhm.
sides. And, which seems like a more equitable recognition of the fact that, there's an imbalance between cars and bikes. And it's not really safe. I know, we have a Cheryl on Pine Street, and it's not safe.
Yeah.
As a biker.
Yeah.
And since, all of the residential, properties that are on that sort of, Pine Street to Shelburne Street, have presumably off-street parking, why is it
Mhm.
necessary to have parking on that side?
Excellent question. It's not necessary. The walk bike plan actually recommended bike lanes in both directions in that stretch, from Pine Street to Shelburne Street.
On Flint?
Yes.
Okay. well,
Yep. And so that is
all
the,
Flint that we're looking
yeah, and so this is the stretch that would retain the parking on the north side. Yeah. And so that is still an option, and if there's a lot of interest in that concept, we can consider that. We were trying to take a more balanced approach to leave some on-street parking available for both residents and for the new business that is at the corner of Pine and Flynn. Redstone has been trying to get a commercial property in there. Parking is always a challenge, so they're very interested in retaining some parking options nearby. Straight lane markings themselves really help bicyclists get in a better position next to parked cars, especially try to get them out of the door zone a little bit so that no one opens a car door into them, and brings more awareness to drivers who are on the street that this is a common route for biking. So it's really just for guidance. And again, this was trying to take just a more balanced approach to these changes. But again, if there's a lot of interest in removing all of the parking in that stretch and adding the bike lanes in both directions, that's definitely an option.
I would like to register that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Harris?
Yeah, I'll agree with Andy, on the one hand. On the other hand, it is good to have some on-street parking if you have, guests coming or whatever.
Mhm.
There is a need for it. But there, Flint was never fully parked, so I think there's a lot of, room there. I really do think there should be bike lane in both directions, even if it's not on both sides of the street, even just on one side, there should be two directions. It seems like a wide enough street that there should be a way to accommodate that. And then my other question is, what about between here and the waterfront?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So that stretch isn't being repaved just yet. We wanted to let the parkway come in and rebuild some of the curb line. We can come back in, make changes to the blocks between Briggs and the railroad tracks afterwards. And then the water department still needs to do some additional work near Oak Ledge Parks. Should make exiting your driveway a little bit easier. The parking that will.
You said there's gonna be parking on the north side of the street?
There will be, but it'll basically be adjacent to the sidewalk, so it'll be much easier to see around any of the parked cars there.
So you're taking out the trees and,
Where the trees exist, that's actually where the parking would end. So the trees start, I think, near the co-op property.
they're all in front of, that whole, yeah, up until, the, Howard Center building.
Yeah, our intent is not to remove any of the trees with that option, but,
Can you zoom in for that?
It doesn't cover the area. that-
yeah, let me get to a different one that has a little more detail, so it's gonna go fast for a minute, so I can really get to the right section. Okay, so this is the stretch just adjacent to the Howard Center, which is right here. So, here's Pine Street,
Right.
and so we're extending the parking lane that's currently there now. We're getting it as close to the intersection as we can, leaving this utility pole, just for
And that's all the
reference.
parking for the Howard Center.
Yep.
right? Yeah, okay.
So then there's another utility pole here, which is why there's a little notch in the parking. And then, I believe we're getting closer to the co-op property. So here's another utility pole just past the Howard Center. And then as we get closer to Foster, this is where the parking would then just be restricted on both sides. In the mailing that went out, we mentioned we're still evaluating what the recommendation would be between Briggs and Foster, and so this plan doesn't show the updated version, where we recently opted to just remove the parking on both sides. as our proposal, and continue the bike lanes in both directions. And so there would be no parking on either side through here, and the parking would not be notched in.
So there wouldn't be parking in front of the car.
Right.
On the section between Pine and Shelburne on the north side, most of those buildings are set back quite a ways. Does your right of way allow, or maybe just don't have the money available to really widen your area at the right way?
We did consider widening it. It is definitely more costly. I don't know that we could do it while we build the notched-in parking on the other block this year. The challenge that we had in that other block as well, since we just built a new sidewalk on that section, it's very close to the curb line right now. We don't have the room to build the same type of parking that we have here without having bigger impacts on that stretch. Does that answer? We do, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
John?
I don't know if we have any neighbors here from the section from Pine to Shelburne Road. I don't think so. And I just wanted to note that it was very difficult and controversial when we put the sidewalk
Yeah.
on that side of the street, and those neighbors were very upset.
Yeah.
And we moved forward with that because we believed that that was the right thing to do, but that really impacted those neighbors. And having, you know, I bike a lot, and I bike with my daughter in a trailer all over the city, and I think that, you know, I have an appreciation for our need for better bike infrastructure, but also having experienced a period of times when I was really had a lot of mobility issues. If you're going to visit somebody who lives in those houses on Flint Avenue, and there's no parking there, and you can't always park in somebody's driveway, it's a real difficulty, and to have to cross a busy street there, I think that that's a pretty significant hardship. In the walk bike plan, in certain places, it specifically spells out that we are planning to remove parking in these areas, and we've done that. And the neighbors didn't like it, but we went ahead and we did that because we committed to that infrastructure. On Flint Avenue, it doesn't actually say that. It does say we're gonna have, we're going to have bike lanes in both directions, but it doesn't say we're going to remove parking to do it. And with these kind of documents, it's kind of a visioning document, and then you have to work out the details. So I appreciate that you have kind of made some concessions here. If you're headed west on Flint Avenue, there actually is kind of a nice downhill, and the speed you travel can be similar to the speed of the cars. So I do agree with Andy. I really don't quite get Shara's. I always read them as run over the bicycles, because there's just a bicycle icon with the cars running over them. But I really like Harris's idea of having both directions of biking on one side of the road, which does have an efficiency. We did it on South Winooski Avenue. It seems that for whatever reason that has fallen out of favor, but it seems like a pretty nice compromise in order to get everything that we need into the street without really negatively impacting some people that don't have very good other options.
Yeah, it's, we'll take another look at all of the dimensions. I don't know that we can fit two-way bike traffic on the same side of the street, but we'll at least check to see if there is a way that we could do it.
Well, I wonder what the definition of fit is. I mean, it worked on South Winooski. What was the, what was the width of that?
Yeah, South Winooski is a little bit different since it is a one-way street, and there's still two separate bike lanes, but
It is now, but it did not used to be. That's a recent change.
right. And the neighborhood did request that we maintain that old configuration at the time, but because it was kind of substandard and did not really fit, we opted with the design that we have now. But we'll take a look at the stretch and. Yes, it's true. It's a good point. Yep.
So we're running up against 8:30, and we were hoping to take a few minutes for one last agenda item, but I know that you wanted to get to a couple other just updates, it looks like in your presentation with respect to spring plans.
Yeah, if we can take the temperature of the room, whatever does make most sense.
Okay. Were there any other comments on, any brief comments or questions on the biking?
Just quickly, another option, have a sidewalk on one side of Flint and bike path on the other side. You can still walk there if you wanted to, but, you know, if you want to walk without bikes, you could go on the other side.
Sure.
I do know, just to sort of follow up on that, there has been some discussion about, rather than having sidewalks, just having sort of asphalt bike paths like that. Has there been any thought with respect to that? I mean, just replacing the sidewalks altogether with a bike path?
Yeah, generally they are less safe than on-road facilities. The number of driveway crossings are usually the biggest challenge. The more driveways you have, the less predictable it is that you're going to have someone on a bike traveling at that speed on what drivers would normally think of as a sidewalk.
Right.
And bicyclists and pedestrians don't mix very well.
Yeah.
As someone who's ridden the bike paths of Denmark, in old cities, they found a way to make them fit.
Yeah.
And they just said basically, priorities bicycles.
Exactly.
Cars are gonna have to give up some space.
Mhm.
And they do.
Yep.
But the main thing is, and this is the thing about the two-way on one side there, that seems awful scary to me. The guy that's going against the bicycle traffic and against car traffic, he's trapped in the middle there. That thing's kind of scary.
Yeah.
They do a good job of separating with actual curves.
Mhm.
Cars know where they're supposed to go. It's interesting in intersections where bikes get priority, but it really doesn't work. And they did it in old small cities.
Yeah.
It's a priority question.
Yes, it's very true. Thank you.
So we just have a couple minutes left. I don't know if that's enough time for you to run through some of the other items that are here.
How about I run through one or two slides? I'll make
Sure.
it very brief, just share some resources we have available. The south end, as I mentioned at the beginning, is going to have quite a bit of infrastructure kind of renewal activity. I already mentioned, that brings real long-term benefits to the community. It also does bring short-term impacts, as I'm sure you're aware from some other projects that we've kind of led recently. So what I want to do very briefly is I'm going to speed through some of these things that may be less directly relevant, and I just want to share with you one resource we do maintain, which is the Burlington construction portal available at burlingtonvt.gov/construction. We'll have a map and a list view, as you can see highlighted there, of all of our projects planned for 2019, and we break them out in other ways: active projects, all the completed projects since the passage of the infrastructure bonds in 2016, as well as all projects kind of that we've completed, all that are underway, and all that maybe are planned for the near term. So it's just one resource we are trying to make everybody aware of for kind of some upfront, check in on our projects, and always feel free to call us for specifics. We maintain another site with background information on the Sustainable Infrastructure Plan itself, which could give you some context as to why some assets are chosen, why we're choosing to reinvest in the ways that we are. It's just some background reading as you're interested. We also maintain a little bit of an outreach section. The letter that you may or may not have received for paving or the Flint Ave bike work, things like that are going to be hosted here, so you'll always have a quick reference as needed for projects you may be interested in. We want to make you aware of some really important projects that will be going on this year, and we pulled a screenshot of our construction portal. We do want to make you aware the Flint Ave water relining project will take place pretty early on in the season. That did get delayed from the end of last season with some delays, and then weather kind of crept up on us. The timing is going to be mid-April. That'll go till July. Flint Ave paving will come in hopefully shortly after that. There'll be some Pine Street water main relining from Flint to Home this year. There will be paving from Flint to Home. There will be a smaller project of an overlay between Lakeside and Flint. There will be some work at the Pine and Flint intersection to rebuild the water main. Reconstructing a water main is a bit more of an invasive project than the relining projects we've already mentioned. So be aware of that. Traffic patterns will be set up with a high degree of certainty to kind of moderate during peak travel times to allow two-way traffic. There's a couple other relining and paving projects set to take place nearby. This is all available online. We're certainly available to answer questions if you want to call us, or if there's opportunities in the future where you would like us back, we certainly welcome that opportunity. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I think this is a much larger discussion. I promise to the folks here that we'll have you back for just regular sort of check-in for folks in the community here. Is the Parkway still on track for this fall? And do you have any thoughts with respect to, is it starting at the southern part? Is it starting in the northern part?
I think in terms of how the project is phased is going to be a conversation with the contractor as that goes out for bid and as those plans get developed. I think the overall scope of risks are and have continually been reduced to the point that we are very close to being able to go out for bid. Fall 2019 probably is a very optimistic date at this point. I think spring is a very highly likely scenario. I don't think we can close the window on fall, but I also wouldn't want to sit here and overpromise that is going to start this fall. But in terms of phasing, I think it's a conversation with the contractor and how that work gets developed.
I have a question about Briggs. I mean, Briggs is terrible, and why aren't they fixing it? I mean, it hasn't been paved for probably 20 years.
I see the city councilor wants to jump in on that one.
I'm glad you asked the question, because a lot of people are wondering, and I keep trying to spread the word. But when City Market went in, the first thing Chip and I said to them is, we don't know how the traffic is going to work here without the Champlain Parkway coming in. And so they originally designed it with the way they would have entrances and exits. With
City Market design.
City Market, yeah. With the parkway there, and the neighbors in all those adjacent streets were very concerned about the traffic impacts because people are going to be cutting through all those neighborhood streets. So there were a couple what they wanted to do was dead end, like Ferguson and Lyman, which will be dead ended when the parkway goes through, but we weren't allowed to do that because the project has been federalized. So we couldn't do that for them. So the concessions that we made, City Market redesigned this building and the entryway so that it comes in off of Flint, and there's a gate on Briggs so that people won't come through on Briggs. But we also agreed not to pave it to discourage people from using Briggs so that they wouldn't be cutting through all those neighborhood streets. Now, we could have not done that. We could have not, negotiated with the late neighbors, but had we not done that, we probably wouldn't be sitting in this room today because there's always a very lengthy appeals process if,
just to pave Briggs, that doesn't have anything to do with people who are living here.
We agreed not to pave Briggs in order to
that's negotiated with the homeowners, is that what you said?
Yes. In order to kind of mitigate the negative impacts on the people who live closest to it.
For folks who are interested in sort of the Burton higher ground issue, I point to it as an example of, an area where, for better or worse, there are concessions that can be gained out of being involved in this process as we go forward. I think Briggs is an example of it. When you look at the back entrance of the parking lot being closed, that was another example of it. And as Joan just mentioned, them reconfiguring the entranceway here. So people power does have some power in these types of projects, and I think the evidence is found out here, for better or worse. I think better for the neighbors here, worse for the folks who are obviously trying to travel Briggs, but
they'd have no place to go to.
Right, exactly.
Well, people have always traveled Briggs. It's just gotten worse and worse.
Now we go on the other day.
Connecting to home access.
We do. We have regraded it in the past, and that's something that would happen when the ground thaws in a few weeks. So that is certainly on the table. I think I checked my records. I think it was April or May last year when we got back out to regrade. Any other short-term repairs right now in the winter would be arguably ineffective because of the condition of the road and the material we've got.
I think it's great because it's one way that Burlington can empathize with the rest of Vermont.
We have one
All right, well, thanks to the folks from DPW.
Thank you.
If folks would entertain just a couple more minutes. We talked in the very beginning about adding one more agenda item, and I don't want to necessarily rush it, but there are folks who are willing to stay just a couple more minutes.
Thank you.
Thanks. So very briefly for folks who came in after the beginning of the meeting, a few months ago there was an effort at the city council level, not from our councilors but from some other wards, to discuss Npa funding. And there was a resolution that was put on the table at that time that would increase funding for the NPAs for a very specific purpose, which would be for a micro grant program as well as for a community award program. And members of this steering committee sort of pushed back on it a little bit, saying, wait a minute, it was really sort of the first time we had heard about it. We didn't have a time to really digest it. When we thought about it further, we thought that perhaps we don't necessarily have the same bandwidth as some other wards may have to really manage a micro grant program and accept applications and review them for a couple $100 here, a few $100 there, and so on. So among our steering committee, we had a discussion of, yes, we could benefit from some increased funding as an NPA. Maybe another ward would want to use it for a micro grant program. Maybe this ward would want to use it for that, or perhaps for more community engagement. What I mentioned in the beginning of the meeting was, we've had discussions amongst ourselves in the steering committee about having a larger event. I'll use the example again. Elisa brought up when she was previously on the steering committee doing a pancake breakfast. Being able to afford childcare services to come in such that we can make these meetings more accessible to families with young children. Or maybe even doing some more advertising. These signs right over here were signs that were purchased a while ago to advertise meetings in the neighborhood where folks put them out there, but some of them are out of date now because they advertise our meetings being at DPW. And so there's this, again, for folks who weren't here earlier, there's this all wards organization where they invite in the steering committee members of every NPA around the city. We had a meeting recently that Joanna Grossman and I were at, and we came to a consensus among the different wards that we would go back to our individual assemblies and see if you all were interested in passing a resolution which, again, it wouldn't increase our budget. All the resolution would do is it would be forwarded to the city council for consideration on increasing each NPA's or each ward's budget to a higher level to, from our perspective, to be able to better our community engagement activities. Our budget at the moment is currently, as I mentioned before, $400. The number that all wards came up to with that each ward would bring back to their individual assemblies was $2,500. It's a relatively big jump percentage-wise. Maybe it's a sort of ask for more than thou shalt receive, but it's the number that we came up with as a group, and that we committed to the All Wards organization that we would bring to you all here. So I know we've run over, and it's not an issue that I necessarily want to rush. So if we need more time, then perhaps we can delay it to another date. But the agenda item, that sort of the resolution here. Again, it starts with some general language about the NPAs being established 30 years ago, that the NPAs play an integral role in allowing residents the opportunity to engage with their neighbors, so on and so forth. If you can keep scrolling down.
I'll keep scrolling.
It talks about how a $400 budget, it allows for us to purchase snacks and things like that, but doesn't necessarily allow us to consider and be creative and think outside the box. With respect to, again, things like childcare services or larger events. So it doesn't sufficiently allow us to really maximize those efforts. And that with a larger annual budget, that we may be able to increase community engagement by better publicizing our activities, increasing meeting accessibility to a more diverse group of neighbors, and including by providing meals, childcare services at certain meetings throughout the year. Just as an example, wards 2 and 3, they're lucky enough to have sort of a volunteer workforce that's available to do this, but they do a community meal before their NPA meeting, and it's great. It brings in a much more diverse group. Families come in, it's a free meal, and then the NPA meeting immediately follows the meal there, and it brings in a larger group, a more diverse crowd, and that's what we're looking to do here. So happy to answer any questions folks may have, but again, each NPA is bringing this back to their assemblies, this request that the city increase the annual budget of the NPA of each NPA to $2,500 for fiscal year 2020. To confirm, again, just a request. We don't have the power to increase the budget. That would fall to Councilor Shannon and Chip and and their colleagues on the city council, as well as the mayor and CETO's office and so on. In fact, we had a discussion with CETO about, we don't really necessarily know where this money would come from. Maybe it would come from CETO's budget, maybe it would come from some other bucket. The intent here is to really relay to the city that the wards have come to a consensus that the NPAs could benefit from some increased funding. So happy to answer any questions folks would have, but the ask here is to turn to the question of this resolution, and it's not something I want to rush if people want to take a pause with respect to it, but if people feel comfortable with it, then this is one of the more formal areas where we could take a vote on it, and if it votes, then we would basically pass it along to the mayor and the city council. Yeah, Elisa?
Two questions. First of all, Joan, what kind of timing in city council would if this didn't get voted on?
I don't think there's a rush tonight to do
Okay,
this, because
so-
this is gonna come before our new council that hasn't, we all get sworn in on April 1st.
Right.
So, our budget is getting adopted in the next few months, so, it's, in order to be included in the budgeting, it would need to be done probably in the next month or so, but I don't think it has to be done
Tonight.
I think it could be done at the next meeting, but that's probably as long as you could wait. I don't think it's urgent tonight.
Right.
So my point on that is also, I believe the way our Ward 5 bylaws are written is that if we are going to vote on something, we need to warn it in advance, just like a regular election.
Right.
So that it's great, bring it up now, decide whether we want to bring it forward at the next meeting, and then warn it in the minutes and in the agenda item, and have it ready to be voted on at the next meeting with proper legal warning.
Right.
And then that way, we'll have more people in the room, hopefully, and
Maybe.
more people involved, but we hope. That's
We don't
what
have
want.
Burton next month.
We want. Well, today is actually World Water Day,
Yeah.
and there was a huge event down at Echo, I believe, and a lot of people were down there for that, so maybe we had some competition
Yeah,
tonight, and
yeah.
the city, and the school board, so, but that would be my suggestion, is that if we go through our standard bylaws, that we would, warn it and have it voted on at the next meeting.
Right. I'm comfortable with that. I think, the bylaws are a little bit fuzzy, which is why we wanted to dust them off for next month anyways. I think you can read them a bunch of different ways. One is, maybe it does need to be warned 10 ways. The other is, well, as long as we have a critical mass that's in support of it, maybe we don't have to do that. But if there's any question marks about it, obviously I want us to, I'm a lawyer after all, so.
I move that we adopt that this be warned and voted on at the next meeting.
Okay, that we put it on the agenda for our next meeting, which is
Maybe
April
somebody should
18th.
second
It's
that.
less than a month away. Yeah, second, okay. Just sort of by show of hands, folks who are ready to, yeah, Paul, did you?
Now it's time for discussion. So
Yeah.
we have it, so.
Yep.
The number that specifically says 2,500, and I'm wondering if that offers them the chance to say, nope, it's too much. Done, it's over, as opposed to wording that's a little more flexible, like a substantial increase, maybe as much as 2,500 or something like that.
Yeah.
I don't know if it just makes it too easy to shut it down. Is that
And is
Yeah.
it because it's going to all of the wards in this exact same wording?
Well, no,
last
each
part
ward
is-
is doing something a little bit different. The dollar figure is the same number that each NPA is bringing back to their folks. Joan, did you have a comment on that, or?
Well, I think one of the things that's important to us, because our funds are tight, even small amounts can be critical in our budgeting process, is to know how the money is going to be spent. And so you've come up with some ideas, but I think that should be an important part of the discussion, is what do you need $2,500 for? Would it be micro grants? Would it be more food? Would it be outreach? So having a little bit more of a gelled idea of how the money is used, I think, is important.
Right. The $2,500 number was the number that the groups that had talked about that micro grant program that translated into a resolution that was somewhat news to us when it came forward to the city council, but in any event, that $2,500 number was the number that they had discussed then. And so when we came back together as this all wards group, that was the number that came up again. It was the number that we were able to come to some sort of consensus about, everyone feeling comfortable about going back to their individual assemblies. Truthfully, there are other assemblies that are out there that would want that number to be significantly higher than even 2,500, and I think that Joanne and I, as the representatives from Ward 5, were understood the inclination to put the brakes on that a little bit. So,
Are there 8 wards, 9 wards? How many wards are there?
so there are 8 wards, but there are so each ward, the proposals, each ward would have $2,500.
So
There are only
multiply that by 8 to get the.
right. So the number is $20,000. Right.
From 3,200 or?
Correct. So we can have, it sounds like we're heading in the direction of putting this back on the agenda for next month, which actually makes sense because, as I mentioned before, we were hoping to bring the bylaws up again then as well, and we're having steering committee elections next month as well. So perhaps we can have a much broader discussion about the NPA and its future and its role in our community, and this could be a part of it as well. So we have a question on the table to put this item on the agenda next month, the resolution. If you're in favor of that, raise your hand. Anyone opposed? Okay, so we'll put this on the agenda for next month. We'll report back to the All Wards group that we'll be discussing on April 18th, and I think that'll be fine. So thanks all for your patience. Thanks again to City Market, obviously, for hosting us. Thanks to Councilor Shannon for coming and joining us. Thanks to CETO for live streaming on Channel 17, and hopefully we'll see you all next month as well. Thanks.